So what do we say? What's our response? Let's bring it home to someone has said this to me. Now what do I say?
Well, again, I go back to Pigliucci, who offers a few problems for scientism. I just wanted to read a couple of quotes from him. The first, he says, "Scientism is philosophically unsound. This is because a scientistic attitude is one of unduly expanding the reach of science into areas where either it does not belong, or, and he cites human values, or it can only play a supportive role. I am not here engaging in a parochial defense of philosophical turf," he says, "as I see both science and philosophy as crucial to atheism," again, he's an atheist in particular, "and to human understanding in general. Nor am I endorsing a simple demarcation criterion between science and philosophy. Science is best conceived as a family of activities, having a variety of threads in common, including but not limited to systematic carrying out of observations." So what this basically means, I think, is the first thing you should say to a scientific person in addressing them is, well, science isn't a unified thing. It's actually a family of enterprises, of methods. So what do you mean by science, and where does it actually end, and where does non-science begin? Is history science, for instance? Is something like critical theory, literary theory, grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics? Where do those things fit in? And if they want to just expand out and say, well, I'll count that as science, then they really have to have something that they're using to determine where science ends and what they're not going to allow in science to begin. And is that going to be just empirical observation, or is it going to be based on some methods? And that's a really difficult question. And ironically, it's a question that's answered by the philosophy of science, not science itself.
So basically you're saying that just by them giving a definition for it, their definition is going to have to include things outside of itself, which makes the belief itself fall flat on its face. Yeah. Okay.
Right, because you're going to have to define science, and you can't use science to define science because you're already it's circular. You're already going to have to assume what you're going to count as science in order to delineate what it is. In order to really put your arms around it fully, you're going to have to step out of science. And philosophy does a really good job at moving to these upper levels, sort of doing these meta moves and moving beyond and turning back and looking at other disciplines. That's why we have the philosophy of biology, the philosophy of physics, the philosophy of science in general, and logic, and all these things, and even the philosophy of logic. So, and even the philosophy of philosophy, for that matter. So it's really in that realm that you can discuss what science is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So can you quickly give us the few things that are also in the video that I'm going to link to with William Lane Craig? Give us a few of those things that empirical science has to assume, or that we can't necessarily prove through empirical science. What are those bases of knowledge that are outside of that?
Right. So Craig gives 5, and I think they're really easy to memorize. So the first would be logical and mathematical truths. And what Craig says is science presupposes logic and mathematics. And what you should know is that these are largely a priori, or basically not based on empirical data, these fields. They're based on rules that and relationships that are sort of defined, and through them we can deduce new truths. And science makes use of mathematics all the time. It makes use of classical logic all the time. So that's one thing. The next thing that Craig brings up is what he calls metaphysical truths. That sounds really trippy or weird, but these are truths that we take for granted. They're sort of truths that just strike us as obviously the case, and they would be things like, there are other minds. So I think Tim has a mind. I'm talking to Tim. It could be that I'm in some weird sci-fi universe, and you're an android, this sort of like Blade Runner or something, and you're not actually. There's nothing behind the flesh, but maybe gears and silicon or something. How could I prove it? Well, all the evidence would point to both directions, and you could say, well, which is the simpler hypothesis, things like that. But honestly, it's actually really hard to prove that there are any other minds than the one your own. Yeah. So that's the first thing that he points out. Another one is that the external world is real. Wow, what does that mean? Well, it'd be something like The Matrix or Inception, where this idea that all of reality could be actually in my mind right now, mind generated. Well, how do I disprove that scientifically? All the data you'd be collecting is from your perceptions and your experience, and all of that could be mind generated. So it's actually something that science can't disprove. There are philosophical reasons to reject it, but then you're stepping out of science. And another one of the sort of metaphysical truths would be that the universe didn't just pop into existence 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, that it just looks like it was 13.75 billion years old, and that I have all these memories of living a life for 30 some odd years and all that. How do we disprove that? All the evidence could point either way. So, and then he also brings up ethics. In a large degree, science depends on ethics, and it's been notoriously difficult for science to do ethics. It can inform ethics, but if science tells us what is the case and ethics tells us what ought to be the case, there's this sort of logical distinction that science has a real hard time jumping over and telling us ought statements. And so really we need a sort of methods of ethical thinking and ways of ethical thinking. And for that, you read Kant or Aristotle. You wouldn't really read necessarily evolutionary psychology, though that might help you understand why we think the way we do. It doesn't tell us how we ought to think about morality.
Great.
So those are three. I don't know if you have time for two more, but
yeah, give us the other two.
Okay, yeah. So the next one is he talks about his aesthetic judgments, and this is kind of weird. These are judgments about the beautiful and the sublime. That is sort of the stuff that strikes us and overwhelms us, and the stuff that we just are inspired by. And in our culture, I think it's common for us to think that those sorts of judgments are purely subjective. But there is a sense, I think, in which it's really hard for us to say that it's just a matter of opinion whether Fauré's Requiem is just as good or could be considered worse than Rebecca Black's Friday, something like that. So how can science can tell us maybe what our brain's doing when we're experiencing the beautiful or the sublime, but it can't tell us what constitutes a correct judgment of what's beautiful and what's sublime.
Yeah.
And then lastly, we already discussed the fifth one, which is that science cannot justify science. That's circular. And again, so Craig brings that up. And again, you have to move to that upper level. And to do that, really, you'd have to move to something like epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, or the philosophy of science and its various divisions into the philosophy of physics or the philosophy of biology.
Awesome. Well, great. Daniel, that was really great information, really good stuff. Guys, there's going to be a link right here for a video that I'm going to talk about, or that I've already recorded on purposes, and how particularly science, if you have a purpose, now you're stepping outside of science, kind of what he was just talking about. You have to have something that you're directing toward that is ought. You have to come up with a purpose so you can say this is what it is, but that doesn't tell you what it's ought. So click on the link right around here. That will take you to that video, and you can watch that as well. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the Everyday Apologist. I appreciate your knowledge, wisdom, and friendship. We'll talk again soon.
Oh, can I plug my blog for you there?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, so I have a a silly little blog that I just throw up arguments and stuff like that for philosophy, and it's vexingquestions.wordpress.com. And so check it out. A lot of the stuff is just stuff I'm throwing against the wall to see, what sticks and that type of thing. So I appreciate comments and whatever.